The snow fell softly on Ashton Falls, covering the streets in a sparkling white blanket. The charming little town seemed plucked from a Christmas card, with its twinkling lights, wreaths on every door, and the faint sound of carolers singing in the square. It was Christmas Eve, a time when families gathered, children laughed, and strangers exchanged warm wishes. Yet, for William Bradford, none of it mattered. William, known to most as Will, strode briskly through the modest airport, his black cashmere coat trailing behind him. He barely noticed the festive decorations that lined the terminal, the garlands wrapped around railings, or the towering Christmas tree that stood in the center of the hall. To him, Christmas was just another day to be endured. Will had spent decades building an empire in real estate. Once an idealistic man with dreams of changing the world, he had become a billionaire focused solely on profits. The sacrifices he made along the way, relationships, family, joy, were neatly rationalized as necessary. Tonight, he was eager to escape to the Maldives, where the beaches were warm, the people unobtrusive, and there was no sign of tinsel or holiday cheer. As he approached the gate, a sharp voice called out, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't get on that plane." Will turned, startled. Standing a few feet away was a boy, no older than 10, with wide brown eyes and messy hair poking out from beneath a knit hat. His coat was too small, his shoes scuffed and worn. But what caught Will's attention was the urgency in the boy's expression. "Excuse me?" Will said, his voice sharp. "You can't get on that plane," the boy repeated, stepping closer. "It's not safe." Will's brows furrowed. "Kid, I don't know what you're talking about, but I don't have time for this." The boy grabbed his sleeve, surprising him with the strength of his grip. "Please, you have to believe me. If you get on that plane, something bad will happen." People in the terminal were starting to glance their way, curious about the commotion. Will, uncomfortable with the attention, gently pried the boy's hand off his coat. "Go back to your parents," he said brusquely, "and stay out of trouble." The boy looked at him, his eyes pleading. "Just don't go," he whispered. Shaking his head, Will walked away, dismissing the encounter as a strange, albeit mildly unsettling, experience. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant and stepped onto the jet bridge, eager to leave. Inside the plane, Will settled into his luxurious leather seat, reaching for his tablet to review a contract. But as the engines roared to life, a gnawing unease settled in his chest. He shook it off. It was just a kid's wild imagination, he told himself. The plane began to taxi down the runway when, suddenly, a loud screech pierced the cabin. The engine sputtered, and the aircraft jolted to a stop. Passengers gasped as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, explaining that a mechanical issue would delay the flight. Will's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely unnerved. Back in the terminal, Will watched as technicians swarmed the plane, their faces tense. Stranded for the foreseeable future, he sighed heavily and slumped into a chair near the gate. "See? I told you." The boy's voice startled him again. Will looked up to see the child standing in front of him, a defiant smirk on his face. "You," Will said, his tone a mix of disbelief and irritation. "How did you?" "Never mind. What's your game, kid?" "No game," the boy replied simply. "You weren't supposed to leave." Will stared at him, the boy's calm certainty sending a chill down his spine. Before he could respond, a woman approached. She was in her early 30s, bundled in a threadbare coat, her tired eyes scanning the scene. "Ethan," she said softly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't bother the man." "I wasn't bothering him," Ethan protested. "I was helping." The woman sighed, her gaze shifting to Will. "I'm sorry if he caused any trouble." "He has an imagination." Will raised an eyebrow. "Imagination or not, the plane is grounded. Maybe your son's in the wrong line of work." The woman didn't laugh. "Come on, Ethan," she said, tugging his arm gently. But Ethan stood his ground. "We can't leave yet, Mom. He needs to stay." "Stay?" Will asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. Ethan nodded. "Something's going to happen, and you need to be here." Will stared at the boy, unsure whether to be amused, annoyed, or unnerved. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Well, it looks like I don't have much choice, do I? Ethan smiled, as if satisfied. And for the first time in years, William Bradford wondered if there was more to the world than he had allowed himself to see. The woman, whose name Will learned was Claire, ushered Ethan away with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration, leaving Will alone to mull over the bizarre turn of events. But the boy's words echoed in his mind. You need to stay. There was something unsettling about his certainty, something that made Will uneasy despite himself. Still, he had no intention of dwelling on it. He was a man of reason, grounded in facts and decisions, not the ramblings of a strange child. Will spent the next hour pacing near the terminal windows, glaring at his phone as he attempted to reschedule his flight. Delays stretched into cancellations, and the thought of spending Christmas Eve stranded in this quaint town only worsened his mood. By the time he reached the airport cafe, the once charming holiday ambience now felt suffocating. Families gathered around tables, sharing cocoa and cookies, their laughter grating on his nerves. As he stood in line, scanning the menu without much interest, he heard a familiar voice. Do you like peppermint hot chocolate? Ethan was standing beside him again, looking up at him expectantly. Will sighed, trying to summon the patience he'd long since abandoned for most people, let alone a persistent child. Kid, what is it with you? Shouldn't you be somewhere with your family, opening presents or singing carols? He asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Ethan shrugged. We don't do that stuff. But if you try the peppermint hot chocolate, you might not feel so grumpy. Will stared at him, caught between annoyance and curiosity. Before he could reply, Claire appeared, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. I told you to stop bothering the man, she said firmly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Then she looked at Will, her expression apologetic but guarded. I'm sorry. He has a tendency to insert himself into situations. Will shook his head. It's fine. He's persistent. He glanced at Claire, noticing for the first time how tired she looked. Her coat was frayed at the edges, and the scarf around her neck was thin enough to do little against the cold. Ethan's shoes, he realized, were in even worse shape than he had initially thought. They weren't just scuffed, they were falling apart. Something stirred in him, a flicker of discomfort that he quickly dismissed. You're local? He asked, more to fill the awkward silence than out of genuine interest. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Sort of. We've been in Ashton Falls for a few months. It's temporary. Will knew what she meant without her saying it. Temporary wasn't just about location. It was about survival. He'd seen it before in the faces of tenants who couldn't make rent, people displaced by the expansion of his empire. It was the price of progress, he told himself, a necessary consequence of building something great. But standing in front of Claire and Ethan, he found the justification hollow. Your husband? He asked abruptly, regretting the question the moment it left his mouth. Claire's face tightened. Not in the picture, she said curtly. It's just the two of us. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, piped up. We live at the shelter near the church. It's not so bad. They have spaghetti nights. Will's chest tightened, though he wasn't sure why. He wasn't responsible for their circumstances, after all. Still, the thought of a child being grateful for something as basic as a meal struck him harder than he expected. Claire's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Ethan, don't. It's fine, Will interrupted. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the words came out before he could stop them. The shelter's a good place. I've supported projects like that before. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't a lie either. His company had donated to shelters, though mostly for tax benefits. Claire studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she was trying to read him. Then she nodded, her expression softening just enough to be noticeable. Thank you, she said simply, though there was an edge to her voice, a hint of pride that refused to fully yield. Ethan grinned, seemingly satisfied with whatever unspoken agreement had passed between the adults. So, are you going to try the peppermint hot chocolate? He asked again. Will almost laughed, a sound that surprised even him. Fine, he said. I'll try the peppermint hot chocolate. The three of them sat at a corner table, the boy chattering animatedly while Claire sipped her coffee in silence. Will found himself listening more than he intended, drawn in by Ethan's energy. The boy talked about everything. The snowball fights he had with the other kids at the shelter, his dream of one day building the biggest snow fort in the world, and how his mom made the best grilled cheese sandwiches when they had a kitchen. Will noticed the way Claire's face softened as Ethan spoke, the way she smiled even when her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She clearly adored her son, and it was just as clear that she bore the weight of their struggles alone. As the cafe began to empty out, Will found himself reluctant to leave. He didn't understand it. He had no reason to stay, no obligation to these strangers. And yet, there was something about Ethan's unwavering optimism and Claire's quiet resilience that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. When Ethan finally yawned, Claire took it as their cue to leave. "Thank you," she said to Will, her tone sincere but formal, as though she didn't quite trust him. For humoring him, Will nodded, unsure of what to say. "Good luck," he offered, the words feeling inadequate. As they walked away, Ethan turned and waved. "See you tomorrow," he called. Will frowned. Tomorrow? Surely the boy didn't expect to see him again. But as he watched them disappear into the snowy night, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths weren't finished crossing. The snow fell heavier as Will made his way to the nearest hotel. But even as he settled into the opulent suite, the boy's voice echoed in his mind. "You need to stay." And for the first time in years, Will felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Something that felt suspiciously like doubt. The next morning, Will woke to the sound of muffled carols drifting through his hotel window. The heavy snow from the night before had transformed Ashton Falls into a pristine winter wonderland. He stared at the ceiling, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous evening came rushing back. Ethan, the strange boy with his uncanny certainty. Claire, with her guarded strength. The shelter. The peppermint hot chocolate. Will shook his head and forced himself out of bed. He had no plans to linger in this quaint little town longer than necessary. His flight had been rescheduled for late that evening, and he intended to spend the day tying up loose ends before leaving this place, and its odd encounters, behind. After a quick shower and an uninspiring room service breakfast, Will donned his coat and ventured into the town. The streets were bustling despite the cold, children laughing as they built snowmen and families gathered in small clusters, sipping warm drinks from steaming cups. There was a vibrancy to Ashton Falls that Will hadn't noticed the day before. It wasn't the sterile cheer of corporate holiday parties or the manufactured charm of upscale holiday markets. It was genuine, unpolished, and strangely compelling. As he walked, Will found himself drawn toward the church Ethan had mentioned. It wasn't difficult to find. Its steeple rose above the rooftops, a beacon against the snowy backdrop. The small crowd gathered outside told him he was in the right place. Volunteers in red scarves handed out blankets and hot meals to a line of people that stretched down the block. Will hesitated, unsure why he had come. He wasn't one to linger in places like this. Charity was something he dealt with from a distance, through donations and impersonal foundations. Before he could turn back, a familiar voice called out, "I told you I'd see you today." Ethan bounded toward him, his face lighting up with delight. Claire followed a few steps behind, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. She wore the same worn coat, but there was a new flush to her cheeks, perhaps from the cold or the warmth of the scene around her. "You're really here," Ethan said, as if Will's appearance had somehow confirmed something important. "I knew you wouldn't leave." Will shoved his hands into his coat pockets, feeling unexpectedly self-conscious. "I was just taking a walk. Thought I'd see what this place was about." Ethan grinned, clearly unimpressed by the attempt to downplay his presence. "You should come inside. They're making pancakes." Claire stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to stay. I'm sure you have other plans." Will met her gaze, noticing the slight defensiveness in her tone. He wondered if it was pride or distrust, or maybe both. "I don't mind," he said after a moment. "Besides, pancakes sound better than whatever the hotel was calling breakfast." Ethan beamed and grabbed Will's hand, tugging him toward the entrance. Will allowed himself to be led, ignoring the amused glances from the volunteers as they stepped inside. The interior of the church was warm and bustling, filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of utensils. Long tables were set up, families and individuals seated shoulder to shoulder as they shared meals. The smell of maple syrup and coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the garlands draped along the walls. Will followed Ethan and Claire to an empty spot at one of the tables. A volunteer approached with a tray of pancakes, smiling warmly as she set it down. "Merry Christmas," she said before moving on. Ethan dove in with enthusiasm, cutting his pancakes into messy pieces and drowning them in syrup. Claire ate more slowly, her eyes darting around the room as if she were always on alert. Will, for his part, picked at his food, his appetite dulled by the strange mix of emotions that had settled over him. "You don't like pancakes?" Ethan asked, his mouth half full. "They're fine," Will replied, managing a faint smile. "Just not used to eating breakfast like this." Ethan tilted his head, studying him with an intensity that felt far beyond his years. "You don't do this a lot, do you?" "Do what?" Ethan gestured around the room. "Be around people. Talk to them. Eat with them." Will opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The boy wasn't wrong, but the bluntness of the observation left him momentarily speechless. Claire stepped in, her tone light but pointed. "Ethan, let the man eat." "It's okay," Will said quickly. He looked at Ethan, considering the question. "You're right. I don't." "Why not?" Ethan asked. Will hesitated. He could have given a dozen polished answers, explanations that he'd perfected over the years about the demands of his work and the necessity of focus. But none of them felt right. Instead, he said, "I guess I forgot how." Ethan nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "You can practice with us." The simple statement caught Will off guard, a lump forming in his throat before he could stop it. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, letting Ethan fill the silence with his usual chatter. As the meal went on, Will found himself relaxing, the barriers he had spent decades building softening in the warmth of the room. He watched Claire interact with the other guests, her smile small but genuine as she exchanged quiet words with an elderly woman across the table. He noticed how Ethan greeted everyone like an old friend, his joy infectious. When the meal ended, Claire stood, gathering their plates. "We should get going. Thank you for joining us." Will hesitated, then said, "Let me walk with you." Claire looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but I want to." As they stepped back into the snowy streets, Will felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts or deadlines or the relentless pursuit of more. He was thinking about the boy who believed in him, the woman who carried the weight of the world with quiet grace, and the strange, unexpected feeling that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here. The walk back to the shelter was quiet at first, the crunch of snow beneath their feet filling the silence. Ethan darted ahead, kicking at small piles of snow and occasionally tossing handfuls into the air, laughing as they fell like powdered sugar. Will found himself watching the boy, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of laughter, real laughter, not the forced kind that came in boardrooms or high society gatherings. Claire walked beside him, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. She seemed preoccupied, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead. Will resisted the urge to ask what was on her mind. He had no right to pry, and truthfully, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear her answer. When they reached the shelter, Ethan bounded up the steps and pushed open the door, holding it for them with exaggerated chivalry. "After you," he said, bowing dramatically. Claire chuckled softly and ruffled his hair as she passed. Will followed, stepping into a small but welcoming space. The lobby was modest, with mismatched furniture and walls adorned with handmade holiday decorations. A Christmas tree stood in one corner, its branches weighed down by an eclectic mix of ornaments, some clearly homemade by children, others likely donated over the years. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, a comforting combination that reminded Will of a time he had almost forgotten. Ethan darted off to join a group of kids who were huddled near the tree, chattering excitedly about a game they were playing. Claire lingered near the door, glancing at Will uncertainly. "You don't have to stay," she said after a moment. I'm sure you have somewhere to be. Will looked around the room, taking in the scene. A volunteer was serving cups of cocoa to a line of guests, their faces lighting up with gratitude as they wrapped their hands around the warm mugs. In another corner, an older man was helping a young girl string popcorn onto a length of thread, her giggles filling the air as the kernels slipped through her fingers. I don't, he said finally. Not really. Claire studied him, her brow furrowing slightly. Why are you here? She asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Will hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He could have offered a dozen superficial answers, but none of them felt true. Instead, he said, I don't know. Maybe because your son wouldn't let me leave. Claire's lips twitched into a small smile, though her eyes remained cautious. Ethan has a way of pulling people in. He does, Will agreed. And you? Her smile faded, replaced by a guarded expression. What about me? Why are you here? He asked gently. Claire glanced toward Ethan, who was now laughing as one of the other children tried to balance a star on top of the tree. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Because I didn't have anywhere else to go, she admitted. We lost our apartment a few months ago. I tried to keep us afloat, but it wasn't enough. Will felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. What happened? He asked, his voice quieter now. Claire hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. The building we lived in was sold to a development company. They raised the rent so high that most of us couldn't afford to stay. I fought it for as long as I could, but eventually, she shrugged, her voice trailing off. A heavy silence settled between them. Will didn't need to ask which development company had taken over the building. He already knew. It was his. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling inadequate. I didn't know. Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Understanding, maybe, or remorse. Why would you? She said finally, her tone devoid of anger but not of disappointment. People like me, we're just numbers on a spreadsheet to you, right? Her words stung more than Will expected, cutting through the armor he had spent years building. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Ethan ran over then, breaking the tension with his boundless energy. Mom, Mr. Will, come see the tree. It's done. He grabbed both of their hands and tugged them toward the corner where the kids had finished decorating. The tree was lopsided and cluttered, with garlands draped unevenly and ornaments hanging at odd angles. But it was beautiful in its imperfection, radiating a warmth that no perfectly trimmed tree in Will's penthouse could ever match. It's perfect, Claire said softly, her voice filled with genuine affection. Will nodded, though he barely heard her. His attention was focused on Ethan, who was holding up a small ornament shaped like a star. Can you help me put this on the top? The boy asked, looking up at Will with wide eyes. Will hesitated for only a moment before kneeling down so Ethan could climb onto his shoulders. The boy giggled as he balanced precariously, stretching to place the star at the top of the tree. When he finally managed to secure it, the room erupted into applause. Ethan slid off Will's shoulders, beaming with pride. See? I told you he'd help. Will ruffled the boy's hair, feeling a strange sense of contentment that he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, he felt present, grounded, as if the weight of his life had shifted, even if just a little. Claire watched him, her expression softer now. Thank you, she said quietly, for staying. Will nodded, his throat tight. I'm glad I did. As the evening wore on, Will found himself drawn further into the world of the shelter. He listened to stories, helped pass out cocoa, and even joined in a spirited game of charades. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about work or money or the relentless pursuit of more. He was simply there, surrounded by people who had so little but gave so much. And as he watched Ethan dart around the room, his laughter ringing out like a bell, Will felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. As the evening stretched on, the shelter grew quieter, with most of the families settling in for the night. Will stood near a window, watching the snow continue to fall. The streets outside were peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He could hear faint murmurs of conversation from the rooms beyond, along with the occasional burst of laughter from Ethan and the other children. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, The sound filled him with an unfamiliar sense of peace. Claire approached him, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Cocoa," she said, offering him one. "Not as fancy as what you'd get at one of your hotels, but it's warm." Will accepted the mug, wrapping his hands around it. "It's perfect," he said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. Claire seemed more at ease now, the sharp edges of her earlier defensiveness softened by the events of the evening. Will glanced at her, noticing the way her shoulders no longer seemed as tense, her expression less guarded. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength in her that he couldn't ignore. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, breaking the silence, "about the building, and about how people like you are just numbers to people like me." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly wary of where the conversation was headed. "What about it?" Will hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're right," he admitted. "I've spent my life chasing success, building something I thought would matter. And in the process, I stopped seeing people. I stopped caring." Claire studied him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Will said slowly, "meeting you and Ethan, it's made me realize how much I've lost, how much I've ignored, and I don't want to be that person anymore." She frowned, clearly unsure of whether to believe him. "You think one night at a shelter is going to change everything?" "No," Will said quickly. "I know it's not that simple, but it's a start." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Ethan sees something in you," she said quietly. "I don't know what it is, but he does. And he's usually right about people." Will felt a flicker of hope at her words. "He's a remarkable kid," he said. Claire smiled, her expression softening. "He is. He's the reason I keep going, even when it feels impossible." Will nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. For years, he had thrown himself into his work, telling himself it was all for something greater. But standing here now, he realized how hollow those justifications had been. What good was success if it left you alone, disconnected from the world? Ethan came bounding over then, his energy undiminished despite the late hour. "Mom, Mr. Will, come see this." He grabbed their hands and tugged them toward the corner of the room, where a small group of children had gathered around the tree. One of the older kids had found a guitar and was playing a clumsy but heartfelt rendition of Silent Night. The younger children joined in, their voices sweet and pure. Will watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He felt Claire's hand slip from his as she stepped forward to kneel beside Ethan, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. The two of them began singing softly, their voices blending with the others. For a moment, Will felt like an outsider, watching a world he didn't belong to. But then Ethan turned and grinned at him, his face glowing with joy. "Sing with us," the boy urged. Will hesitated, then stepped closer. He didn't know the words, but it didn't matter. He stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the room, and let himself be part of something larger than himself. When the song ended, the room erupted into applause, the children laughing and clapping along with the adults. Ethan beamed up at Will. "See? You're not so bad at Christmas stuff after all." Will chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Don't get used to it," he said, though the words lacked their usual edge. The night continued in a blur of quiet moments and shared laughter. Will found himself more at ease than he had been in years, his usual cynicism replaced by a tentative sense of belonging. He helped a young mother carry a tray of cocoa to her table, listened to an elderly man tell stories about his childhood Christmases, and even joined Ethan in a game of checkers. As the hour grew late, Claire began gathering their things, preparing to head to the small room they shared at the shelter. Ethan protested, insisting he wasn't tired, but Claire gave him a look that brooked no argument. Will watched them, a strange ache settling in his chest. He didn't want the night to end, didn't want to lose this fragile connection he had found, but he knew he couldn't impose any longer. "Thank you," he said quietly as Claire helped Ethan into his coat, "for letting me stay." Claire looked at him, her expression soft but cautious. "Thank you for being here," she said. "Ethan, he needed this. And maybe you did too." Will nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Maybe I did." As they left, Ethan waved over his shoulder. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Will. We'll watch them go." His heart heavy and full all at once. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door they had disappeared through, before finally turning to leave. Outside, the snow had stopped and the world was quiet. Will walked slowly back to his hotel, his thoughts swirling with memories and possibilities. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't quite explain. And as he looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling against the inky blackness, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would find a way to make this right. The next morning, Will woke earlier than usual, his mind already churning. The hotel room was quiet, the kind of sterile quiet he had once sought out but now found unsettling. He dressed quickly, pulling on the same coat he had worn the day before, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Ashton Falls was still waking up, the streets dusted with a fresh layer of snow that sparkled under the pale light of dawn. Will wasn't sure where he was going, but his feet seemed to know. He wandered through the town, past shop windows decorated with garlands and tiny twinkling lights, past the park where children's footprints crisscrossed the snowy ground. He found himself in front of the church again, its doors already open for the morning services. He hesitated, glancing inside to see a few early risers seated in the pews. But it wasn't the church that had drawn him here. He turned toward the shelter, its modest exterior now familiar. The faint sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the air as he approached, and when he stepped inside, the warmth enveloped him immediately. Volunteers bustled about, preparing breakfast, while residents gathered in small groups, their voices a mix of sleepiness and gratitude. And then he saw them. Claire was seated at one of the tables, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Ethan sat beside her, his head bent over a sketchbook, his brow furrowed in concentration. They looked so ordinary, so much like any mother and son sharing a quiet moment, that Will almost felt like an intruder. But then Ethan glanced up and spotted him, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Mr. Will, you're back." Ethan scrambled out of his seat and ran toward him, holding up the sketchbook. "Look, I drew a snowman. It's going to be the biggest one ever. Like, taller than this building." Will smiled despite himself, taking the sketchbook and studying the drawing. The snowman was indeed massive, with stick arms reaching toward the sky and a hat that seemed impossibly large. "Impressive," he said, "but you're going to need a lot of snow for this." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "There's plenty outside. Will you help me build it?" Before Will could answer, Claire approached, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. "Good morning," she said, her tone measured. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I wasn't sure I'd be back either," Will admitted. He handed the sketchbook back to Ethan. "But your son has a way of convincing people." Ethan beamed and tugged at Will's sleeve. "Come on, let's start before the snow melts." Claire sighed, clearly torn between gratitude and skepticism. "Don't let him rope you into too much. He can be persistent." Will chuckled. "I think I can handle it." Outside, the air was crisp and cold, the snow perfect for packing. Ethan wasted no time, scooping up handfuls and rolling them into a small ball that quickly grew larger as he pushed it across the yard. Will followed his lead, helping him shape the base of the snowman. The two of them worked together, laughing as they struggled to lift the middle section into place. Claire watched from the steps of the shelter, her arms crossed against the cold. At first, she seemed content to observe, but eventually, Ethan's enthusiasm won her over. She joined them, her cheeks pink from the chill, and together they built a snowman that wasn't quite as tall as the building but was impressive nonetheless. Ethan insisted on finding the perfect sticks for the arms and a rock for the nose. By the time they finished, the three of them were breathless and laughing, the snowman standing proudly in the yard. "Best snowman ever," Ethan declared, his hands on his hips as he admired their work. Will couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like this. It felt strange and wonderful, like rediscovering a part of himself he had thought long gone. He glanced at Claire, who was brushing snow from her gloves, her face softer than he had seen it before. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "For what?" Will asked, genuinely puzzled. For being here, she said, meeting his gaze. For helping. For letting Ethan be a kid. Will nodded, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not the kind that felt so genuine. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. It's nothing. Really? But Claire shook her head. It's not nothing. Not to him. And not to me. Ethan ran ahead, his laughter echoing as he darted around the snowman. But Will stayed rooted in place, the weight of Claire's words settling over him. He thought about all the times he had ignored people like her, people who had been displaced or overlooked because of decisions he had made. He had always told himself it was just business, that it wasn't personal. But standing here now, he realized how wrong he had been. Claire, he said, his voice hesitant, I've been thinking about what I can do to help. Not just you and Ethan, but people in situations like yours. I want to do more. She looked at him, her expression guarded but curious. What do you mean? I have resources, he said. Money, connections. I want to use them to make things right, or at least better. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I want to start here. In Ashton Falls, Claire stared at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. You're serious. I am, he said, and he meant it. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond profits and power. He wanted to do something real, something meaningful. Claire nodded slowly, as if she wanted to believe him but wasn't quite ready to let down her guard. It's a nice idea, she said cautiously, but ideas don't always translate into action. They will this time, Will promised. I'll make sure of it. They stood in silence for a moment, the snow falling softly around them. Then Ethan ran back to them, his cheeks red from the cold. Come on, let's go inside and get cocoa. The snowman needs a toast. Will laughed, the sound surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise Claire. All right, kid, lead the way. As they walked back to the shelter, Will felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He was thinking about the boy beside him, the woman who had trusted him enough to let him in, and the possibilities that lay ahead. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Back inside the shelter, Ethan darted off to join a group of children who were playing near the Christmas tree. Claire lingered near the entrance, brushing snow from her coat as Will followed her into the warmth. The lively buzz of conversation filled the air, and the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon reminded Will again of how different this place was from the sterile luxury he was accustomed to. Claire led him to a quiet corner near the kitchen, where she poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. They sat at a small table, the hum of activity a comforting backdrop. Will turned the steaming cup in his hands, searching for the right words. I meant what I said out there, he began, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I want to help. Claire studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why now? She asked. You've probably walked past a dozen people like me and Ethan before. Why do you care now? Her question hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe because I never really saw people like you before. I've been so focused on everything else, I forgot what it's like to actually connect with someone. And maybe it's your son. He has this way of making it impossible to ignore him. Claire's lips curved into a small smile. He does have a gift for that. Will nodded, his expression softening. He's a good kid. Smart, too. He deserves better than this. Claire's smile faded, and she looked down at her coffee. I've tried, she said quietly. I've done everything I can to give him a good life. But sometimes it's not enough. Will hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He slid it across the table toward her. Let me help, he said. Not just with money. I can get you into one of the properties my company owns. Someplace warm, with space for you and Ethan. No strings attached. Claire didn't touch the card. She stared at it, her expression unreadable. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because I owe you. My company was responsible for what happened to your building. I didn't know it at the time, but I should have. This is my chance to start making things right. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Finally, she said, "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Will said firmly. "Think of it as a fresh start, a way to get back on your feet." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Honesty, perhaps, or conviction. "I'll think about it," she said at last. "But I need time. This isn't an easy decision." "Take all the time you need," he said, relieved that she hadn't rejected the offer outright. Their conversation was interrupted by Ethan, who bounded over with a wide grin on his face. "Mom, Mr. Will, they're playing a game in the big room. Come on." Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. "Go ahead, Ethan. I think Mr. Will and I have had enough excitement for one day." But Ethan wasn't having it. He grabbed Will's hand and tugged him to his feet. "You have to come. It's a Christmas game. You'll love it." Will glanced at Claire, who shrugged with a small smile. "You might as well," she said. "He's not going to let it go." Reluctantly, Will let Ethan lead him into the main room, where a group of residents and volunteers had gathered. A makeshift stage had been set up, and a volunteer was explaining the rules of the game, a holiday-themed trivia contest. Ethan dragged Will to a table near the front and plopped down beside him. "We're gonna win," he said confidently. Will raised an eyebrow. "You seem pretty sure of that." "Of course," Ethan said, his eyes sparkling. "You're smart, and I know everything about Christmas. We're the perfect team." The game began, and Will quickly found himself swept up in the energy of the room. Ethan was a natural, shouting answers with unbridled enthusiasm and bouncing in his seat whenever they got one right. Will, for his part, surprised himself by how much he enjoyed it. He had never been one for games, but Ethan's joy was infectious, and he found himself laughing more than he had in years. By the end of the game, their team had come in second place, and Ethan was beaming as if they'd won the grand prize. "Told you we were good," he said, high-fiving Will. "You were right," Will admitted, unable to keep the smile off his face. "You're a tough partner to beat." As the crowd began to disperse, Claire joined them, her expression softer than before. "Looks like you two had fun," she said. "We did," Will said, glancing at Ethan. "Your son's a force of nature." Claire's smile widened. "He gets that from his dad." Will hesitated, then asked, "What happened to him?" Claire's smile faltered, and she looked away. "He left," she said quietly. "A long time ago. Ethan doesn't remember him, and I try not to bring it up. It's just the two of us now." Will nodded, sensing that the subject was a painful one. "You're doing a good job," he said. "Ethan's a great kid." "That's because of you." Claire looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said softly. The three of them lingered in the room, the quiet hum of conversation filling the air. Will felt a strange sense of belonging, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel like an outsider. As the day drew to a close, Claire and Ethan prepared to head back to their room at the shelter. Will walked them to the door, the cold air biting at his face as they stepped outside. "Are you staying in town?" Claire asked, her tone tentative. "For a while," Will said. "I have some things to take care of here." Claire nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well, good night, Mr. Will." "Good night," he said, watching as they disappeared into the snowy night. As he stood there, alone in the quiet, Will felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he was looking forward to finding out. The next morning, Will found himself waking up earlier than usual again. The faint sound of carolers practicing outside the hotel drifted through his window, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel intrusive. It felt calming. He dressed in a hurry, his mind racing with plans he couldn't quite articulate. He had stayed up late, sketching out ideas, revisiting memories, and envisioning what it might look like to truly change the trajectory of his life and the lives of others. By mid-morning, Will was back at the shelter. The staff greeted him with polite smiles, and a few of the residents nodded in recognition. He scanned the room for Claire and Ethan, but they were nowhere in sight. Before he could ask, a volunteer approached. "Good morning, Mr. Bradford," the woman said, her tone warm. "If you're looking for Claire, she and Ethan went to the church." They're helping set up for the Christmas luncheon. Thanks, Will replied. He hesitated, then added, and please, just call me Will. The walk to the church was brisk, the cold air stinging his cheeks. The town was alive with activity, children racing through the snow while shopkeepers tidied their holiday displays. Will couldn't help but notice how interconnected everyone seemed, how their greetings carried a genuine warmth he rarely encountered in his usual circles. It was a stark contrast to the transactional relationships that had dominated his life for so long. When he arrived at the church, he found the doors propped open to let in the crisp air. Inside, the hall was a hive of activity. Tables were being set with mismatched plates and cheerful red napkins, while volunteers arranged trays of food along a long buffet. Claire stood at one end of the room, organizing baskets filled with small, wrapped gifts. Ethan was at her side, his face lighting up when he spotted Will. "Mr. Will," Ethan called, waving enthusiastically. He ran over, nearly slipping on the polished floor, and grabbed Will's hand. "You're here. Are you helping with the luncheon?" Will glanced at Claire, who looked up from her task with a faint smile. "I hadn't planned on it," he said, "but it looks like you could use another pair of hands." Ethan grinned and tugged him toward the gift baskets. "Come on. Mom's been working on these all morning. She's really good at making stuff look nice." Will crouched down beside Claire, who was tying ribbons around the baskets with practiced efficiency. "You've got quite the helper," he said, nodding toward Ethan. "He tries," Claire replied with a smirk, though there was warmth in her voice. "He's mostly good at unwrapping things, not wrapping them." Ethan pouted. "I helped pick out the ribbons." "And you did a great job," Claire said, ruffling his hair. Will reached for a roll of ribbon and began mimicking Claire's movements. "I'm not sure I'll be as fast as you, but I'll give it a shot." She watched him for a moment, clearly surprised. "You don't strike me as the gift-wrapping type." "I'm not," Will admitted, fumbling with the ribbon. "But I guess there's a first time for everything." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the noise of the busy hall surrounding them. Will found himself relaxing into the rhythm of the task, his usually restless mind focused on the simple act of tying bows. He glanced at Claire occasionally, noting the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She carried herself with a quiet grace that intrigued him, a strength that seemed unshakable despite the challenges she faced. As they finished the last basket, a volunteer called for everyone's attention. The room quieted, and the pastor stepped forward, his voice warm and inviting as he welcomed everyone to the luncheon. Volunteers began guiding residents to their seats, and Will followed Claire and Ethan to a table near the front. The meal was a lively affair, filled with laughter and conversation. Will found himself seated between Ethan and an elderly man named Frank, who regaled him with stories of his time in the Navy. Across the table, Claire chatted with a woman who had recently found housing through the shelter's outreach program. Will listened more than he spoke, absorbing the energy of the room and marveling at the sense of community that surrounded him. As the meal wound down, the volunteers began passing out the gift baskets. Ethan was thrilled to receive a small set of paints and brushes, his eyes lighting up as he turned the box over in his hands. "Look, Mom, I can paint my snowman now." Claire smiled, her expression softening. "That's perfect, sweetheart." Will watch the exchange, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen such genuine joy over something so simple. It made him realize just how much he had taken for granted, and how much he still had to learn. After the luncheon, Claire and Ethan lingered to help clean up, and Will stayed as well. As the hall emptied out, he found himself alone with Claire, folding tablecloths in the quiet space. Ethan had fallen asleep on a nearby bench, his new paints clutched in his hands. "You didn't have to stay," Claire said, glancing at Will. "I wanted to," he replied. "Besides, I'm getting pretty good at this whole volunteering thing." Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Will." "Will," he corrected gently. "Just Will." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first met you, I didn't think I'd ever say this, but I think you mean it. All of it. The things you said about helping, about making things right. I think you actually care." "I do," Will said, his voice quiet but firm. "And not just because of what I've done in the past, though that's part of it. It's because of you and Ethan. You've reminded me what really matters." Claire looked away, her eyes glistening. "You're a good man, Will. I think you've just been lost for a while." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Maybe, but I'm finding my way back." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Then Claire straightened, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done, for us, and for this community. It means more than you know." Will nodded, his heart full. "It's just the beginning." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Will glanced at Ethan, still fast asleep on the bench. He smiled, a quiet determination settling over him. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. For the first time in years, he felt ready. The following morning, Will rose with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer felt the usual weight of obligation or the emptiness that often crept in after accomplishing something material. Instead, his mind buzzed with possibilities, each idea laced with the hope that had been ignited by Claire and Ethan. Today, he would start making good on his promises, even if it meant confronting parts of himself he'd rather leave buried. By mid-morning, he found himself sitting in the office of the shelter's director, a middle-aged woman named Susan. Her desk was cluttered with files, reports, and handwritten notes, evidence of how deeply she was involved in the lives of those she served. She regarded Will with polite curiosity as he explained his intentions. "So, you're telling me you want to help revitalize the shelter?" she asked, her tone cautious but intrigued. "Not just the shelter," Will said, leaning forward. "This community. Ashton Falls has potential. It's already rich in heart. But with a little support, it could become a model for how small towns tackle homelessness and housing insecurity." Susan raised an eyebrow. "That's a big vision." Will nodded. "It is. But I have the resources and connections to make it happen. What I need is your insight. You know what's working and what isn't. You know the people." Susan studied him for a moment, then folded her hands on the desk. "I've been doing this for a long time, Mr. Bradford. I've seen people make promises they couldn't keep. How do I know this isn't just a phase for you? Something you'll forget once you're back in your comfortable life?" Will hesitated, her words hitting closer to home than he expected. "You're right to question me," he said finally. "I've spent most of my life chasing the wrong things. But meeting Claire and Ethan, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I don't want to walk away from that. Not this time." Susan's expression softened slightly. "Claire and Ethan have that effect on people," she said with a small smile. "All right, Mr. Bradford. If you're serious about this, let's talk." They spent the next hour discussing the shelter's needs and the broader challenges facing Ashton Falls. Susan's passion was evident as she outlined ideas for expanding services, providing job training, and creating transitional housing. Will listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. By the time they finished, he felt more determined than ever. As he left the shelter's office, he spotted Claire and Ethan near the playground outside. Ethan was bundled up in his coat, laughing as he kicked snow into the air. Claire watched him with a fond smile, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. Will approached them, his steps crunching in the snow. "Busy morning?" Claire asked as he drew near. "Productive," Will replied. "I've been talking to Susan about some ideas for the shelter." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're really going through with this?" "I am," Will said, meeting her gaze. "And I could use your help." "My help?" she asked, clearly surprised. "You've been through this," Will said. "You understand what it's like in a way I never will. If I'm going to do this right, I need people like you to keep me honest." Claire hesitated, her expression guarded. "I don't know, Will. I'm not exactly an expert." "You're more of an expert than I am," he said. "Just think about it." Before she could respond, Ethan ran over, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, Mr. Will, come see the snow fort I made." Will grinned. "Lead the way." Ethan dragged them to a corner of the playground, where he had built an impressive snow fort complete with walls and a small tunnel. He beamed as he explained the fort's defense system, pointing out where imaginary guards would stand to fend off invaders. "This is incredible," Will said, crouching down to inspect the fort. You've got a future in architecture, kid. Ethan puffed out his chest, clearly pleased. You think so? Absolutely, Will said. You could build anything you set your mind to. Ethan's grin widened, and he turned to Claire. Mom, can I be an architect when I grow up? Claire laughed softly. You can be anything you want, sweetheart. They spent the rest of the morning playing in the snow, building a second fort to challenge Ethan's original creation. Will couldn't remember the last time he had laughed so much, his usual concerns and responsibilities forgotten in the face of Ethan's pure joy. As they walked back to the shelter for lunch, Claire turned to Will. You're good with him, she said. Ethan. He looks up to you. Will glanced at the boy, who was walking a few steps ahead, his arms stretched out like airplane wings. He's a remarkable kid, Will said. I just hope I can live up to what he sees in me. Claire's expression softened. You already are. Her words stayed with him through lunch and into the afternoon as he made calls and sent emails, laying the groundwork for the projects he and Susan had discussed. Each step felt like progress, a small but meaningful way to give back to a town that had shown him more kindness and connection in a few days than he had experienced in years. That evening, as the sun set over Ashton Falls, the town square came alive with music and lights. Families gathered for the Christmas Eve celebration, a tradition that brought everyone together for carols, hot cocoa, and the lighting of the town's massive tree. Will stood near the edge of the crowd, watching as children darted around the square and couples held hands beneath the twinkling lights. Claire and Ethan found him there, Ethan holding a candy cane he had just been given by one of the volunteers. Aren't you coming to sing? Ethan asked, tugging on Will's sleeve. Will hesitated, then smiled. I guess I could try. They joined the crowd near the center of the square, where a choir was leading the group in a rendition of O Holy Night. Will had never been much of a singer, but as the voices swelled around him, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. Claire stood beside him, her voice soft but steady, while Ethan sang loudly and slightly off-key, his enthusiasm infectious. As the final notes of the song faded into the crisp night air, the mayor stepped forward to light the tree. The crowd cheered as the massive evergreen came to life, its lights casting a warm glow over the square. Ethan's eyes sparkled as he gazed up at the tree, and Will felt an unexpected pang of emotion. Merry Christmas, Mr. Will, Ethan said, looking up at him with a wide grin. Merry Christmas, Ethan, Will replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the crowd began to disperse, Claire turned to Will. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. Will nodded, his heart full. This is just the beginning, and for the first time in years, he believed it. The morning of Christmas Day dawned cold and clear, the snow sparkling under the pale winter sunlight. Will woke early, the weight of the previous night still lingering in his chest, but this time, it wasn't the heavy burden of regret or loneliness. It was something lighter, a sense of anticipation, as though the day held possibilities he had only begun to understand. After a quick breakfast, Will made his way to the shelter. The streets of Ashton Falls were quiet, most families still tucked inside their warm homes, unwrapping gifts and savoring the holiday morning. He carried a small bag in one hand, its contents chosen carefully the night before. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When he arrived at the shelter, he found Claire and Ethan in the dining room, where a handful of families were already gathering for the special Christmas breakfast. Ethan was seated at one of the long tables, excitedly showing another child the small set of paints he'd received the day before. Claire stood nearby, helping a volunteer set out trays of muffins and fruit. She looked up as Will entered, her expression softening. Good morning, she said. You're here early. Couldn't sleep, Will replied with a small smile. Besides, I couldn't let you have all the fun without me. Claire chuckled and gestured toward Ethan. He's been up since dawn. I think he's more excited about painting than he was about the tree lighting. Will glanced at the boy, who was now demonstrating how to mix colors with exaggerated seriousness. He's got talent, he said. Maybe he'll paint something worth hanging in a gallery someday. Maybe, Claire said, her voice tinged with pride. He's already painted half the shelter in his head. They shared a quiet laugh, the ease between them growing more natural with each passing moment. Will hesitated, then held up the bag he was carrying. I brought something." Claire raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Will opened the bag and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. "It's for Ethan," he said, his voice almost shy. "Just a little something I thought he might like." Claire took the package, her fingers brushing the edges of the wrapping paper. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Will said simply. Ethan spotted the package and raced over, his eyes wide with excitement. "Is that for me?" Will crouched down, handing it to him. "Merry Christmas, buddy." Ethan tore into the wrapping with a whoop of joy, revealing a small wooden easel and a set of high-quality watercolor paper. He stared at the gift, his mouth open in astonishment. "This is so cool," he exclaimed. "Now I can paint like a real artist." Will smiled, the boy's delight filling him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "I thought it might help you with those big ideas of yours." Ethan threw his arms around Will in a spontaneous hug, catching him off guard. "Thanks, Mr. Will. You're the best." Will patted the boy's back awkwardly, his throat tight. "You're welcome, Ethan." Claire watched the exchange, her eyes shining. "That was thoughtful," she said softly. "He's going to remember this." "It's the least I could do," Will replied. "You've both given me more than you realize." The morning passed in a blur of activity, with volunteers and residents sharing stories and laughter over plates of pancakes and hot cocoa. Will found himself drawn into conversations with people whose lives had been shaped by struggles he had never faced but was beginning to understand. Their resilience humbled him, their gratitude inspiring him to do more. As the day wore on, Will found a quiet moment with Claire, the two of them sitting on a bench outside the shelter. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun glinted off the rooftops, casting long shadows across the empty street. "You've changed," Claire said after a long silence. Will glanced at her, surprised. "What makes you say that?" Claire shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "When I met you, you were closed off, like you were carrying the weight of the world, but you didn't want anyone to see it. Now, it's like, I don't know, you're lighter, more here." Will considered her words, then nodded slowly. "I think I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of what it would mean to let people in, to care about something more than myself." Claire studied him, her gaze steady. "And now? Now I know it's worth it," he said simply. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." She smiled, her eyes softening. "I think Ethan would agree." Will chuckled. "That kid has taught me more in a few days than I've learned in years." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crisp air bracing but not uncomfortable. Will found himself thinking about the future, about all the things he wanted to do, not just for the shelter, but for himself, for Claire and Ethan, for the people of Ashton Falls. For the first time in decades, the path ahead felt open, full of possibilities he had never considered. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting the town in a golden glow, Ethan burst through the shelter's doors, his new easel tucked under one arm. "Mom, Mr. Will, look what I painted." He held up a small sheet of watercolor paper, the image still wet but vivid. It was a simple scene, a snowman standing beneath a brightly lit tree, its branches adorned with glowing lights. In the background, 3 figures stood together, their hands joined. "It's us," Ethan said proudly, pointing at the figures. "Me, Mom, and Mr. Will." Will felt a lump rise in his throat as he studied the painting. It wasn't perfect, the lines were wobbly, the colors bleeding into one another, but it was beautiful in its sincerity. He met Claire's gaze, seeing the same emotion reflected in her eyes. "It's perfect," Will said, his voice thick. Ethan beamed. "I'm going to hang it up in the shelter so everyone can see." Will smiled, watching as the boy dashed back inside. He turned to Claire, his heart full. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me be a part of this, of your lives." Claire reached out and touched his hand, her fingers warm against the cold. "Thank you," she said, "for reminding me that there are good people out there." They sat together as the sky turned from gold to twilight, the lights of Ashton Falls twinkling like stars. And for the first time in years, Will felt at peace. Not because he had everything he thought he wanted, but because he finally understood what truly mattered. It was, without a doubt, the best Christmas of his life.